I hope everybody will have a chance to engage and please go ahead and say hello in the chat. Please use the chat function to speak to each other. If a few just housekeeping notes, if you're not speaking, would really appreciate if you can just put yourselves on mute and cameras off as well, if possible. We're not using a webinar function. This is more of a community, so this is a community Zoom. And this is going to be in the English language. However, if anybody wants to ask questions in Myanmar, either in person or in the chat, please feel free to do that. And I will also double as your translator today. So tomorrow, Dine Pamalo Biomara Mahopau, English Lodiga Bioma Bashin, Tabime, Megon Nero, Machina Shida, by Pio Pamalo Swinage solution, let Chatema, Domaho, let town be Bono, tomorrow, Diet, Swinwe Beba, Yaba, Jumani, translator and turns out so really again welcome everyone. So my job today is really just to say this welcome and also just very importantly also to thank Authors, which is a strategic security and advisory business based in the UK, made up of extremely distinguished individuals, and I'm incredibly thankful that they are sponsoring this for the Myanmar Institute of Directors and the extended community. In times like this in our country, I'm also grateful to have friends and associates across the world who have really stepped up and come to help us. And I think helping us feel connected to all of you is one big gift that we have. So our speaker today is Mr. John Taylor, who's had a very long, distinguished career with the British Foreign Service, and right now is part of Authors as an associate senior research fellow at King's College London in the Department of War Studies. I hope that there will be a longer introduction of John given by our next speaker, who is Mr. Nick Watson, who's the Director of Networks at Authors, who really has been working with us to put this together and to be followed by a few other webinars as well. So welcome again, everybody. And Nick, over to you. It would be great if you can introduce yourself, your firm, and then, of course, more on John. Thank you.
Thierry, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon on behalf of Authors. To introduce myself very briefly, the first part of my career was in foreign service with the British government. I trained as an Arabist and spent 12 years in the Middle East, where I learned a lot about leadership in times of stress and conflict, as maybe you can understand. The last 10 years before I joined Authors, I spent as a partner in a professional services company, providing international business leaders with the advice and insight that they needed to underpin their most important commercial decisions. And now, as you say, I'm a partner and director at Authors Limited. To introduce the firm very briefly, we are an internationally focused security and advisory business with a strong focus on ethics and public service. In that context, of course, we work with commercial companies, but we also really enjoy working with NGOs around their trickiest issues. And in that context, we're absolutely delighted today to be working with the Myanmar Institute of Directors at this challenging time in your history. We work with, as you say, a network of senior figures, many of whom are former government servants who bring a wealth of experience and expertise. And our specific services include things like investigations and open source intelligence. We support clients with hard to find technologies. And we also have a wide range of people related offerings, ranging from recruitment through coaching and leadership development, and also including a strong training offering. But we know that the challenges that our clients face are hugely complex ones. So our aim is to put together the most flexible solution to any challenge that our client may come up with. However, you're not here to listen to me, and I'm going to stop talking shortly because the person you really want to hear from is John Taylor. I'll let him introduce himself in more detail, but suffice to say that he has a wealth of experience, both of leading in times of stress and conflict himself personally, and also of training. And in fact, he trained me about 25 years ago. So John, with that, over to you.
Nick, thank you very much, and Thierry, thank you very much, and indeed to all of you. It's an overused word to say it's a privilege, but when I told a very good friend and colleague of mine who's professor of psychology at University College London that I was doing this talk, and indeed I was looking for a little bit of help and advice from him, he said, "But John, that's the one place in the world I really want to go to. You, John, have to do really well because you've got to get an invitation to go to Myanmar." And I have to say that is very much my feeling as well. It's been a fascinating country throughout my life. I lived and worked, I worked like Nick in the Foreign Service and served in Delhi, which I had 4 fascinating years in India, and felt, you know, very close to that region, your region. So I think I might just be a bit out of focus. I think that's better. So it's a great privilege, honor, and yes, I do have an ulterior motive, and that is that as soon as it becomes possible, both from lockdown probabilities here, but more worryingly, more seriously, your own problems in Myanmar, it would be wonderful to be able to come and visit you. I will say a little bit more about myself, but I should perhaps explain what's going on around me. I live in East London, not far from where Thierry used to work, and live on a boat. And hence, I could disguise all of this stuff behind me. But, you know, one of the problems with this sort of Zoom, Teams sort of discussion is that you don't really get to see much of the people that you're talking to because we all put something behind us. Now, this is the bunk room in the boat on which I live. So this is my permanent home. It's a very large boat in East London. But you've got my wife's teddy bear up there and her violin up there. That's just part of it. You can also see, if I'm careful, you can see I have a dog. Lovely dog, and I hope he's not going to interrupt us very much. He's usually pretty good. When he gets bored, he just goes out of the room. So a little bit more about me. Before I go ahead though, Thierry, I just want to be sure. I will try and speak clearly and everything else, but if you feel that I'm speaking too quickly or my sound goes off, I'm looking to you on my screen to wave passionately or do something to tell me to slow down or whatever is necessary.
I will do that, John. It sounds great for now. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Thierry. So yes, it always worries me a bit because when I introduce myself and I can see the audience, I'm looking at an audience and I say bluntly, I joined the Foreign Service in 1971, recognizing that not many of them were even born when I started work there. But I had a fabulous career. I loved working for the British government and the opportunities it gave me, not just to serve the government, but serve the country, but to learn so much by traveling. As I say, I went to New Delhi, but prior to that, I was in Moscow, I was in Stockholm and in Geneva, managed a whole range of different issues. Gradually, yes, you climb up the ladder. I became head of training, head of HR. And so when I left the Foreign Office, as one has to do, well, we did then, we don't now, at a particular retirement age, I decided to set up my own company. And my passion, really, apart from foreign policy and understanding more about what goes on in international situations, was training. So my company did training for trainers, leadership, management, HR, interviewing skills, writing reports, all sorts of things. I mentioned Adrian Fernham, professor of psychology, very bad company in forms of University College London. It was actually wonderful, but you'd go there, you might share a glass of wine with some students, but you'd have these very wonderful discussions and learning from them was very important to me. So for the last 20 years, I've been training companies, I've been coaching, I've been mentoring all over the world. I was in Afghanistan shortly after the Allies took back control, and was involved in 2 years there mentoring one of the cabinet ministers at a very senior level, and went back to Kabul quite often. It was still pretty risky in terms of personal thing, but we were well looked at. I'll talk about that later. Also visited Somalia, Somaliland, Kenya, and of course many countries in Europe, mostly in Scandinavia, but all countries in Europe, North America, South America. So quite a wide experience. And as I said at the beginning, the big gap in all of that is visiting your own country. Yes, and as Thierry mentioned, wonderful to be invited by King's College London to join their War Studies department and talk to many of their students and contribute to their courses on some of their masters and PhD programs. It's a great privilege and quite a lot of fun. Okay, well, let's start talking. It's about 9:43 here. It's a good afternoon to you there. I know 3:15, I guess, coming up to. So I'm going to talk for, I don't know, 30 minutes. Thierry will shut me up, or indeed Nick might well shut me up if I'm going on too long. But I hope not to. I hope to speak for around 30 minutes or so. And I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I might flip in and out of the PowerPoint presentation because I actually think looking at people or listening to them and seeing them speak is more important than looking at words on a screen. But there are some words I want to show you. So I will flip in and out, and I hope I can manage that without too much problem. So the issue which is raised is about leadership styles in times of stress and conflict. Let's just first look and see what it is that I'm trying to get over. Let me just see, there it is. So I'll put that on full screen for you. This is what I'm trying to achieve. And as you can see, therefore, it's going to be in two parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory. And what I want to do is to put the theory that is evolving in our world, here in Europe and in North America, how it's evolving, what are the new themes coming to play in our world, and then compare that very, very favorably to what I understand and I've read. And obviously, since I've known about this talk, I've looked quite a lot at the work of Buddha and at what happens in Myanmar, about leadership there. And you know, there's a lot of similarity, particularly in the new wave. So I'm hoping to bring some of those things out in the first part of my talk. But then I want to do something, you know, what practically can we do as a leader, as a senior manager? What can we do to reduce the vulnerability of those three things: your staff, your company, and you? You can change the order, I don't mind which is most important, but it is about those three things that I want to address. So let me just talk, let me just show you three quotes which I quite like in putting together this talk. I'm writing a book at the moment and I'm looking at some fiction. And that second quote, it's very interesting when you identify good writers and you look at the plot, which is obviously a very important part of it, And you look at the characterization, how much do you know about the people? But the really good writers talk about character, about what do the people in these works of fiction, film, books, plays. Shakespeare was brilliant at it, I would say that, but he was. When they're under true crisis, Hamlet contemplating suicide, wonderful expressions. But it is at times of crisis in our more humble world, coming away from Shakespeare and the like, that we are challenged, and that's when true leaders are going to be. So let's have a look at this. I'm going to show you a table now, which shows the characteristic of successful leaders as decided, as voted for by their managers. And this was done about 15 years ago. And it shows these are the things that senior managers, and to some extent the staff, considered to be the most important characteristics, qualities, if you like, of a successful leader. And right up there at the top is honesty. And second, competence. Then we go through a list of other things which will be familiar to us. And one of the things that has struck me very much over the last few days, but in fact it's been over a few years, but a few days in the sense I've been focusing on the subject, is this thing about charisma and humility. Now, I was very tempted to put up a picture of Donald Trump, but I thought that might be a little bit controversial. But you have charisma, which is very attractive. And I remember growing up, I remember in the service in the Foreign Office, everybody talked about the importance of leadership, of charisma, of how you had to be there and your presence, you had to speak well, you had to have this ability with other people. And that was what they looked for. And I went on training courses as a participant, listening about what I should do as a potential leader, and then as I became one. And that's what it was all about. What is happening now, and I went to a lecture last summer, it's much more about humility, about freedom from arrogance, and not self-preoccupied. And that is one of the things that's coming through very much. What are the problems about charisma? And I think, I said I wasn't going to talk about Donald Trump, but if you go down that list, Donald Trump, classic narcissist, wouldn't accept responsibility for failure, takes more credit for success than his family. Do you remember those times that he stood up there and said, how it was he who was responsible? We know he didn't listen to feedback. He didn't learn from experience. He felt entitled. I don't know too much about destroying companies, but I haven't followed his business career, but I suspect that may be. If you look then at humility, humble individuals, they admit their mistakes, spotlight others. Listen, you can read that yourselves. And when I read about, what does the Buddha do in times of crisis? Of course, this is where, the thinking of people who come and believe in that kind of thing, have learned from the Buddha and all the teaching and everything else. It's very much what happens in this world, your world. And you've been doing it all the time. We are just getting there, I believe. And so let's just very quickly, and this is your world, and by all means, you crack on in if I've got this wrong, or if you feel that I'm misrepresenting it in some way. But this is the sort of things that I'm learning from reading about Buddhism. To have a purpose. This sort of is at the beginning. It's about why are you doing something? And just this morning, I thought, well, let's just see what our company, Altruist, has to say. And the first line on their website is helping you reduce risk. That's their purpose. It's our purpose. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But it is not so much the vision. When you talk about charismatic leaders, and when I was being taught leadership skills, everybody talked about vision. That's important, but that was the first thing. Whereas it's now being turned around, and here's Colin Powell, senior, he was a very senior military person as well as Secretary of State. But it's about the sense of purpose into the heart of every follower. So that, I think, is a good. Then we do a mission, and this is as far as Altruist is concerned. What Altruist is doing is we are trying to help you operate with confidence. So this is how we're going to go about helping you, whether it's through advice, through training, through providing you with political reports. It's about how you operate. And then to have a vision. I love this quote from Lewis Carroll. If you don't know where you're going, well, you're going to get there, aren't you? Because any road will help. But in our world, and this is very much my world of training, one of the things I find most difficult, least satisfying, put it that way, is when somebody says, John, will you come and run an interviewing course? You've got 6 people, teach them how to interview new entrants. I can do that. I've been doing that for decades. Much more satisfying is when somebody comes to me and says, John, what I really want is for you to train my staff, particularly my interviewers, and how to mentor, coach, or indeed to train other people in our company, in our department, in order that they can be good interviewers. But then, you know what, John, after a few months or a year or so, I don't need you anymore because we'll have that capacity. We know how to train you. You've given us all the skills. That gives me real satisfaction, so that it is in the language that governments like to use and others, but it's capacity building. Setting the tone. I've used that second quote there by Lao Tzu many, many times in my own leadership lectures, over the last 3 decades. But it is very much about having the confidence as a leader to give control. Captain Marquet, that US Navy retired gentleman who said that first thing, he was given command of the US Navy's worst disciplined, worst performing submarine. And it was an enormous shock to him. But his leadership was about giving control to staff rather than saying, I'm in charge over everything. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. But his whole thing, his book, I recommend it very strongly. It's about, if anybody's interested in the Navy and submarines, it's all about that. But it's also about how he turned that submarine round from being the worst performer with people with very low retention rates, very low retention rates, turning them around. Excuse me, Harry, enough, stop the snoring, I beg your pardon. So that he took that from being in a very low performing submarine to a very high performing one. So I recommend his book. And then finally, this is the 5th of the principles. Everything you say and do, people notice. And I can think of so many examples in my experience when working in government of somebody who just said some offhand comment and people read it and listened to it much more carefully. If you want somebody to be really honest about, if you want a culture, which we all do, of honesty, particularly over things like expense claims, that's fine. But if you hear that your boss has stretched those expense claims because he'll take his wife on a trip, or he'll always order the best quality wines at a meal, yeah, everybody else is going to look at that and say, okay, fine, well, if he can do it, I'm going to do it. Everything that you say is so important, and it's something that I think we all need to bear about. Okay, enough of the theory behind that. This is all going to be very familiar to you. I've got a few more slides just to introduce you to the ideas also and thoughts on what practically can you do. So let me just share with you a little bit here. These are the sorts of things that I picked up looking at what various leaders have written, whether they're civil servants, whether they're Forbes type people, whether they're British, American, French. And I've tried to collect together a series of things. I come up with 6 things. And I think I have sort of chosen them a little bit with the idea of some kind of difficult times, stress and conflict. But if there is stress and conflict amongst, or stress and worry amongst staff, then the leaders need to be visible. It's no good you thinking, right, I'm going to go into my office, I'm going to plan, and I'm going to make everything work. They need to see and hear you wherever they are. And that's, okay, we're in the UK, we're under quite a, well, just coming out of a severe lockdown. I know you've had similar things and you've got certainly problems now. But this sort of thing, that's why I say, you know, I don't mind this stuff behind me, because I want people to get a feel for me, not the fact that I'm, you know, living in some preordained thing by Zoom or MS Teams. You've got to be fit. And I know there's a work ethic, and people will say, oh, you know, I'll sleep in the office. I can manage on 3 or 4 hours sleep. That's rubbish. I know there are times when it's so difficult and worrying that you feel, you know, that you can't go to sleep. But sleep and fitness, just general fitness. So keep a routine, keep yourselves physically fit, because that certainly helps the brain. Arrogance. I remember joining the office 50 years ago, and, you know, everybody was taking themselves very seriously. The leaders had to be, you know, in this sort of position. I don't take yourselves too seriously. Recognize that, you know, you have weaknesses. We have weaknesses, I certainly do. And people will then be able to relate to you, because one of the things that you want is for people to express dissenting voices. And so the next thing is encouraging dissenting voices, but you can't encourage that if you set yourself so high up on a pedestal. I am the best. Nobody's going to challenge you. And therefore, you've got to encourage dissenting voices in order to get discussions. Reassurance, very important, obviously. You've got to, and again, the Buddha had lots of good things to say about this, but to live with uncertainty. You know, there are going to be mistakes, there are going to be crises, there are going to be sadnesses. Let's not hide from those. Let's accept that they are there. And that, going on with that, admitting that things often fail. So where does that take us? I just want to quickly touch on leadership styles. There's this consultative, participative, decisive. I'm going to talk to you in a few minutes about an experience I had in Libya. And, you know, it was a fairly fast moving situation. I was in charge of a group of people and the whole operation. We had to get out of the country quite quickly. And, you know, I was thinking I have to be decisive because I'm the one who's responsible. I have to make decisions. But at every stage, I was able to talk to the key people, even if it was only for half an hour, and hear from them what they thought we should be doing. I'll talk about that later. But there are times I have to recognize that when there is a crisis, you've only got 2 or 3 minutes, then you have to make a decision. And of course, you can't just say, oh, well, come on, let's have a meeting. What does everybody think? And, you know, the hordes are coming into the shop or the apartment or to the office or whatever it is. And you've only got a few minutes to make a decision. Of course, that follows, and you've got to be prepared for that. So I talk about preparation. How do we go about doing it? So we're going to talk a little bit about risk assessment. And I'm going to show you the UK risk assessment, which was published 3 or 4 weeks ago. That's for the whole of the United Kingdom. I think it's relevant. But each threat, each risk that you can think of, is to compare it with a probability. So how likely is this to happen? What is the impact of that threat, that particular threat going to be? And what are the time frames? So let me just show you the UK risk assessment. Now, this, I don't know if you see, anyway, it's this year's. So on the left, on the vertical axis, you can see it's the impact and the relative likely. Top right, you'll see pandemic influenza. Now you might think, oh, well, that's very easy after the event. Sad to say, that was there in that exact same position 8 years ago. And yet, so everybody recognizes in government that a pandemic, like coronavirus, a pandemic is the most likely event, risk, threat, and that its impact would be great. Now, to put it in that position was absolutely right. But it was about what do you do about it that so many countries, including the United Kingdom, didn't get right. So it's all very well just doing this theory and saying, you know, well, the severe weather, climate change, there's going to be attacks on transport from cyber threat or from terrorists or whatever. It's all very well doing that, but you've got to follow on and think about how. So I'm going to introduce you to, I've not found this anywhere else, so I'm sure it exists somewhere, but it's about planning for risks and all of those sorts of things, threats specifically. Risk is the general thing, that there are risks. Threats I'm defining as the specific thing. So I'm not going to try and put myself in your position in Myanmar. I can't possibly imagine how it would be, but I will talk about some of the threats. And if you wish in discussion to talk about them, I'm very happy to respond to that, but it would be presumptuous of me to try and imagine what kind of threats that you might be facing or worrying about. Now, what I'm urging is that you do your risk assessment, as we did on the previous slide. You know, what are the risks to my company or to my staff or to my own self or to my family? What are the risks? What is the impact? You know, and what is it? And I will be giving lots of examples. But here is, so if we take a threat, let's take coronavirus. That's the threat. It is a disease which spreads its capability of spreading is enormous. It doesn't have any filters. It will attack anybody and everybody, from the British Prime Minister, who a year ago was suffering very badly in intensive care. Those are the sort of things that they're going to do. And then underneath, you can't do anything. The threat exists. It is capable. It is going to attack everybody and anybody. You can't change that. But what you can change is how vulnerable you are. And you know, the British National Health Service became very vulnerable because it didn't have the right kind of kit and equipment. It was very nearly overwhelmed because people hadn't invested in that kind of thing. The vaccines are now available, and that is reducing our vulnerability enormously. But it's after the event that, you know, well, they didn't know, to be fair, they didn't know the nature of the threat, so they couldn't develop the virus, the vaccines as quickly as they needed. But that's certainly what they were thinking about. So whatever kind of threats, and I'm now going to talk about some of my own personal experience, this is the way that we want to try and adjust that. So let me stop that and talk to you directly. Is that better? Can you all see me? Yeah, good. So I want to talk about some of the places I've been and some of the threats. So some of them at the beginning are going to be quite simple, and I'll end with a more complex thing. But, so I go to Somaliland. And in Somaliland, we are building, this is a British government funded project. We're building their government processes in Somaliland, in North Africa. It's a country which is ridden by terrorism. Al-Shabaab is the particular terrorist group that operates in that northeast part of Africa, Somalia and Somaliland. Very fond of Somaliland, they're lovely people. And they looked after me very nicely. The people themselves, very peaceful and pretty honest, you know, as honest as you would certainly find in the UK. So, you know, I wasn't really worried as I took my team there about criminality. But I was worried about terrorists finding out that we were doing this. You know, the job was only about training their government as trainers. So I was setting up an academy, those sorts of things, so that they could train their own staff and a whole range of skills needed by the government. But my main worry as the leader of this group was the fact that Al-Shabaab would discover that we were there, we were Westerners, prime target. So, so we had to operate against that. And as I looked at our vulnerabilities, two things became very clear. One is, you know, half a dozen white people wandering, not white, male and female, but still white people wandering around Hargeisa, capital of Somaliland. You know, we're going to draw attention to ourselves. But the other thing that worried me a lot was, well, I have lived overseas. I've had security training because the Foreign Office gives us how to look after ourselves. A lot of the people that I was bringing with me, electricians, people who were going to set up the building, things like that, they had none of this experience. So in order to reduce the vulnerability, they had to be trained, and we had to be very disciplined about how we went into Hargeisa because we had to do the shopping. So mostly we brought in trusted people, Somalis themselves, who would go out and work for us, but they were all government people in order to reduce that vulnerability. And we had protection from the UK as well. So we had Somaliland people protecting us, but also UK people. And that worked, but then the UK people said, well, you're only contractors, we only really defend government officials. And although it was a government thing, they said, no, we can't defend you. And I had to pull out. I felt that without that kind of professional protection service, which comes from the UK, the Somalilanders were great, but they didn't have modern weapons. They certainly weren't up to managing an attack by a terrorist group, and I had to pull back. I just killed our operation, came to the British government and said, the risk is too great. If you cannot afford to protect us properly, I cannot have my team, electricians, working in that environment. So we pulled out. I've got lots of other examples, but the one that I really want to talk to you about is, I want to take you back to the 15th of February, 2011, just over 10 years ago. I and a team doing a very similar project to the one I just described in Somaliland. We were in Libya. And we were responding to a request through the British Embassy, but were being paid for directly by the Libyan government, that is by Colonel Gaddafi's government. We were establishing, again, an academy for them so that they would be able to train their own people in specific skills. And we were giving them all sorts of things. But the course we were running, and I was running with a full team of people out there, was about 6 of us. It was quite a big contract, well, for me it was anyway. And there were 6 of us also there working closely with the embassy, and as I'll pick that up a little bit more, but others, but our client was the Libyan government, Colonel Gaddafi, and they all talked about him. Well, the irony is that Gaddafi had decided that the Libyan government needed to operate better and more effectively in Western societies. And he was just beginning. I'm no defender of Gaddafi, please don't go. But he was actually just changing the way the Libyan government was operating. That is to say that they had to be more responsive. They had to be aware of human rights and things like that. So some of the awful atrocities that his governments have done in the past, he was moving away, and he was wanting reassurance about how to make it happen better. And we did, although I never met Gaddafi, I met many of his ministers, and we knew he was following the program very closely. But those of you who've got a historical bent to your mind will remember on the 15th of February, the Arab Spring hit Tripoli. And there we were. We went on to the top of our building, and there was all sorts of tracers from machine guns and all sorts of things. I'm not a military man, so I don't know what sort of things they were. I first of all thought they were fireworks, but I was quickly put right on that. But they were, everything was going. Now, there were 2 phases to my risk assessment, my threat assessment. When I first went out there, I was worried. I wasn't worried about criminality at all. I wasn't worried about destabilizing, about people marauding in the streets. I've been there a few times. It was a very peaceful, law-abiding community. So I wasn't at all worried about that sort of thing. But what I was worried about was our own communication systems. Mobile phones we knew could be cut off at any time. The Libyan regime governments had cut those sorts of things. Computers had been closed down. So I recognized that as a risk, and we bought, to some extent, but a large satellite independent, and it was battery driven as well, so that we could, in emergency and regularly, and we did use it, communicate securely back to our base in London. And we had our own setup in London and check-ins and all the rest of it. So we were worried about that. I was a bit worried about document security. We're pretty sure that the Libyan government was going to be pinching anything we had on our computers, and any documents we left we left around. So all of those sorts of things, I sort of reduced the risk. The vulnerability was pretty minimal. And we knew we could communicate. We knew we were pretty safe. That wasn't a big risk. But suddenly on the 15th of February, all of that changed around. There were people on the streets, the airport closed down, communications actually didn't do too badly, but transport was a real problem. Getting to the airport was pretty difficult. The British Embassy didn't have their own security force of any, certainly not to help us anyway. And airlines just stopped leaving the country. So the unpredictability, I can say to you, that I showed you the impact and vulnerability graph, impact and likelihood graph. This did not appear. Nobody. I know Nick said he's from Middle East expertise, but I do not believe at the beginning of February in 2011, Nick would have said, or anybody in that kind of community would have said, John, be careful because Gaddafi's regime is about to fall. Nobody was saying that. So we have to be, as leaders, prepared for the unpredictable. But throughout this it was about 36 hours period where the uprising started, and when we eventually found an aircraft which was flown in by Shell to come in, we were not at all sure what was going to happen. So yes, I was there. I tried to follow those 6 principles. What I always did was that I always asked everybody around me, what views did they have? What did they think? How, about the threats and then the solutions to it. So that consultative thing worked. But when a decision needed to be taken, I was willing to take it. But you know what? Nearly always we all agreed, and it sort of came back to the fact that yeah, that works for us. So that's the one thing I would do. The other thing I would say from that is what I call networking, because that's the one thing that will help when you've got a crisis. Is the fact that you've got good relationships, people in the embassy, that's not difficult, people in the Libyan government. Now that was a bit more difficult. We had to select, select, it wasn't a business of going and saying, oh, well, let's have an interview to find out who, but you had to identify, assess who were the people you could trust. And we were doing that all the time. There was one man, Colonel Muhammad, who would always just give us a little bit more information when we asked him during the earlier phase of the training program. And so he was a very good friend, and he helped us get the right kind of protection out. And it was he personally who did it, not the government apparatus was all over the place, as you can imagine. And we also had good relationships with the businessmen in Tripoli, and indeed, as it turns out, back at home, because the way we got out was by piggybacking, hitchhiking a lift on a Shell transport that was brought in aircraft, and we were able to get on that. But it's by networking, and it's networking that's going to help you when times are unpredictable. I'm very happy to take questions on all of that. I just want to end by going back to the screen, and if I can just click that one, get that up. So I just want to summarize. As I say, I'm very willing to take all sorts of questions. And this is about the practical things. I think that, the skills you have as leaders and all of those things, given your background, given where you come from, I'm absolutely sure you have that. Planning is all important. Doing the risk assessments, as I say, look at the impact and the probability and the timelines, go through that process. What is the risk of a shopping mall in Myanmar being attacked, which is where you have, or business being stopped for whatever reason. Look at the specific threats. Look at the capabilities of whatever that thing is. It's probably going to be, 100 out of 100, but where are you vulnerable? Is it by staff coming to work? Is it because they're going to have to use public transport? Is it because of the actual position of your premises? Is it because of your communications? Will your communications break down? Each of these are particular threats to be assessed, and what are your vulnerabilities? Communication was a big thing for us. If people are staying at home, how are you going to contact them? Are there handheld radios that you can issue to your key staff and have a sort of domino system so that they can be kept in touch? Is there any kind of physical training people need? Not to go out and do anything scary, but just to protect themselves so that they are able to anticipate and see problems and to take appropriate action to pull back. The 6 behaviors that I put up earlier about visibility, about lack of arrogance, humility, and things like that, these are all key things to what you should be doing and how you can help. And finally, you know, we have learnt something that you've known for thousands of years, but humility is a much more powerful quality of a leader than charisma. And I don't want to leave it on that. Theory, I'll hand back to you. Nick, you may have something to add. I'm sure you will. But very happy to take questions or to add comment to what I've said. Where are we? 10:20. That's what, 4:50.
Perfect timing, John. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for all your thoughts. We do have one question in the chat box, but before we do that, maybe I'm just going to check if Nick, you wanted to add anything, say anything, and indeed, you know, if you also want to facilitate, if you have questions yourself as well, please go ahead, Nick.
I'm not taking any questions from Nick. It's part of difficult. He's always asked the difficult questions.
No, thank you, Thierry. I think that John provided a very good overview and left us actually with a really helpful summary, which I hope will be of some value to your members going away. And I think what we should do is move straight to questions and give your members the chance to ask anything they might like to speak about.
Thank you very much, Nick. So